Welcome back to the net. All right, welcome back to the Net to Net podcast. I'm your host, Sam Kelty, and this is another episode of our college football edition of the Net to Net podcast. Today, we'll be talking about kind of the previews of this upcoming games and touching on the status of certain players and certain teams, so we're gonna hit it right off this week. We don't need to preview any of the games because we already did that episode. It was our first episode. We did the previews right after all the games ended. I'm going to try to do that as quickly as possible for this week's games, but just kind of going forward, that's kind of my goal. But to start the episode today, we're going to talk about. So we got some undefeated teams going up against each other. We have Georgia and Liberty. Don't play this weekend. Liberty got the win against Middle Tennessee on Tuesday, and then Georgia is on the bye. It's good for Georgia to be on the bye because they get to take some time. They did lose Brock Bowers and to an injury last week. He came out in I believe it was earlier in the day. I believe it was like first, second quarter. But there's no timetable on his recovery. He did have surgery on his left ankle. So there could be a potential that he returns this season. There's a potential he doesn't. But that is a big loss for Georgia because if you have watched Georgia throughout the season, pretty much everything runs through Brock Bowers. He's their leading receiver. He's their best player. With him being out, it really kind of is going to show what this Georgia team is made of without having Brock Bowers there, because Brock Bowers is really his like Carson Beck's like cover. He could check it down to him. He could throw it up there, and he would get it. But without him, it's going to be an interesting offense to see. So the other games that are happening that are undefeated, you have Washington taking on Arizona State. So Washington is one of 11 unbeaten teams. They just came off a big win against Oregon at home. They have Arizona State and Stanford. Couple easy games they should win, but right now they're still ranked about 14.2% to win out and go through to the Pac-12 championship. Honestly, the Pac-12 is so wide open. I think Washington will be there, but then you have the choices of like Oregon, USC, Utah. You have Oregon State, just to name a few that have a chance to get there. So every win counts in the Pac-12, and every loss will count against. So it's wide open. And then, so they have Arizona State this week. They have Stanford next week. 2 easy wins. They should be 8-0 after 2 weeks, but in college football, you never know. And then they are at home against USC, or they go to USC into the Coliseum, and then they're at home against Utah and to Oregon State to round out that. So there's not a lot of margin of error for Washington. But you talk about Washington. Michael Penix Jr. is the favorite to win the Heisman. He should be one of the favorites. I like him a lot. He had an unbelievable game last week against Oregon. He had 4 touchdowns over 400 yards, and he had 1 pick. That he overthrew his guy, which it was just an obvious error there. But you're talking about Michael Penix Jr. having unbelievable numbers this year. The run game pretty much matched Oregon. And then they honestly, other than Ohio State, might have one of the best receiving cores in the country. You're talking about Jalen McMillan, who didn't even play against Oregon, but he was supposed to have a big role leading up to the game because he was injured. He was not playing. They tried to give it a go, but unfortunately he didn't get going, and he had to come out for the rest of the game. Then you have the likes of Jalen Polk, who we're talking about a guy that can do everything. He can move. You can line him up at running back. You can line him up in the slot. You can line him up anywhere that seems fit because he's so versatile. And we're talking about an offense that likes to throw the ball a lot. Penix will almost always throw for a lot of yards. He gets the ball downfield, and Jalen Polk is that dynamic. And then you talk about Rome, Odazei. I always butcher his name. Is one of the best deep threats this year. He's really taken his step to the next level. He is unbelievable. Odunze is one of the best deep threats, like I mentioned. He had an unbelievable game against Oregon. He is one of the best receivers out there. He's in my top 5 receivers going into next year's draft. And we talk about this man. He has 6 touchdowns, 736 yards on 40 receptions. He averages 18.4. The man just destroyed Oregon's cornerbacks. He had 128 yards for 2 touchdowns, averaged 16 yards on 8 reception. Rome Odene, honestly, by the end of the season, Rome might be the second best receiver behind Marvin Harrison Jr. So I would just keep a lookout for him. Washington, it's gonna be a shootout to play against them. So I like Washington's chances against Arizona very easily. In the next 2 weeks, they should be fine. The next undefeated teams you have going is Ohio State versus Penn State. Ohio State wants to come in here and just beat Penn State again. You have Ohio State have beaten since 2018, has beaten Penn State 4 times. Nittany Lions might have some talent that edges over the Buckeyes. Are we talking about first year Drew Aller, who's looked amazing? He is averaging 6.93 yards per attempt. That's 93rd in the country. He also has only 11 completions for 20 yards or longer. That's tied for 114. So he has some improving, but he's very raw. He averages not a ton of yards, but he's a game manager. He manages the game very well, and that's just the experience because he is a first year starter. And then you talk about the defense. They're the number 1 defense in the nation. That's in fewest yards allowed, rushing defense, and passing defense, and sacks per game. They will likely go after this young quarterback in Kyle McCord. And you've seen the struggles from the offense from Ohio State throughout the season. It's been up and down for the most part, but Penn State, they looked very good last game against UMass. They beat them 63-0. Yes, it's UMass, but I think this is a big game for both teams. Let's be real. James Franklin's over. James Franklin has to perform this week and has to perform next week or in 2 weeks because they play Penn State. Penn State plays Ohio State and Michigan after their bye, and Franklin is 4-14 against both schools. Penn State needs this win, I think, because they've lost Ohio State a lot more over the years, and I think it's time for Penn State to step up. But then you have Ohio State on the other side. They're a very talented defense. They really rely on their defense. Jim Knowles, like I've been giving his praises all season, one of the best defenses in the country. JT Tolamalu, he's been prolific in the closing minutes of games. We've seen it throughout. We saw it in the Maryland game. We saw it in the Purdue game. We saw it in the other games previously. Kyle McCord, he keeps getting better. 5 touchdowns, no interceptions, 596 passing yards over the last 2 games. But there has been some hiccups. He struggles against the pressure, so look for Penn State to send 4 to 5, 4 to 5 to rush the quarterback. Penn State leads the country in sacks per game. They average 4.5, which, as an Ohio State fan, I would be worried. They also are 7th in the nation in pressures. They put 99. That's a lot. Ryan Day's offense better be able to hold up. Their offensive line better be able to hold up. This is a young group. We forget that. This Ohio State team is very young, very raw. So look for that. And then we talk about the defense side. It's going to come down to their defense to win them games because they don't really say make those flashy plays, get those a lot of sacks, get tackles for a lot. They have been limited to big plays, but they keep points off the board. Jim Knowles been crediting him all season. I think it's going to come down to the defenses because both offenses honestly aren't that great. I would slightly give it to Ohio State just because they have the names. They have more flashier names, but from them, it could go either way. And for one of these games, it's going to go down to who has the ball last with 2 minutes left. Just like I said against Washington, just like I said against Ohio State, Notre Dame, just like I said against USC when they played Notre Dame, except for they ended up getting smashed. But yeah, and the same thing with Duke versus Notre Dame. Whoever has the ball in the last 2 minutes of the game will probably win the game, and it's going to be I don't see this game being a blowout for either team. I think it's going to be close, but I could be wrong. The next undefeated team, I'm going to go with it's Michigan versus Michigan State. Obviously, Michigan's going to win this game. They are so good. They averaged 30 or more points in 10 straight games. It's one of the longest streaks in active history. You have the likes of Blake Corum, who's one of the best running backs in the country behind. He's up there with Audric Estime. He's up there with Jonathan Brooks out of Texas. And like I mentioned, Audric Estime out of Notre Dame. Corum is tied for the most rushing touchdowns among all FBS backs with 12. Roman Wilson is looking like a really good receiver. He's not getting the credit that a Dunze out of Washington or a Marvin Harrison Jr. or a Xavier Worthy out of Texas or Keon Coleman out of Florida State get the recognition. This man is tied for the most receptions with 9. And we're talking about a very good defense, a very good offense, an all-around team. J.J. McCarthy, a dark horse for the Heisman. He's looked unbelievable. He's probably the best quarterback in the Big Ten. They have 2 tough games. They got Ohio State at the end of the season. They got Penn State coming up after the Michigan State game. They got Maryland, and then they end their season at Ohio State. It's going to be a very good game, and then with the whole scandal on top of it, who knows what's going to happen to Michigan at the end of this. So, but I like Michigan over Michigan State. Michigan State has been all over the place. They don't have a true coach. There's rumors of Urban Meyer's coming, but there's no way Urban Meyer's is coming. He's already stated multiple times he's done coaching in college. He's done. He has no urgency to go back. So, Michigan State fans, you can get your hopes up because he's not coming. The next undefeated team you have is Oklahoma versus UCF. Dylan Gabriel returns back to UCF, and the Sooners have the second highest probability of winning out of any undefeated team behind Ohio State at 41.1. Their strength of schedule is 45th in the country. as of the rest of the league, with exception from Texas. But Oklahoma, they have that win against Texas. They've looked strong all season. They have a very good season finishing up. So look for them to be in the Big 12 championship. So I like Oklahoma against UCF. Its UCF team is not the same UCF team we've seen over the past 5 years when they were playing in the AAC when they had Dylan Gabriel. The next game we have is North Carolina versus Virginia. Drake May has looked unbelievable. He had a great game against Miami. He threw for 4 touchdowns. The defense forced 4 turnovers. This Mac Brown defense and offense is looking great, especially when you get Tez Walker back. He is so dynamic. He can stretch the field. He can take some pressure off the other receivers, but he is unbelievable. He had a great game in his debut, finally getting able to play because of that eligibility. He had 3 touchdowns, 175 yards, and that's in one game. Let's be real, that was in one game, 132 yards, 3 touchdowns on 6 receptions. That was one game, and that was last week because he played in one game before, and he only had 43 yards. But Tez Walker, he's going to be something to help that North Carolina team stay undefeated. Then you have Duke versus Florida State. I like Florida State if Riley Leonard is not available. If Riley Leonard is not available for Duke, Florida State. But if Riley Leonard is available, it's going to be a good game. But I like Florida State slightly. Jordan Travis, Keon Coleman, they're the real deal. That's why Jordan Travis is in the Heisman running, and Keon Coleman, literally, you have that man can do everything. So beyond that, Florida State, they still have Miami, they still have Florida, and then they got Pitt to rank still. But you never know. Florida State could be in the college football playoffs by the end of the season if they win out the ACC. You have Air Force Navy, a great rivalry. Air Force is 6-0, so look for Air Force to continue that against Navy. But we're talking about defenses that have improved over this season. We're talking about North Carolina. They have been impressive all season. You have the likes of Cameron Rucker. You have the likes of Alaji Husi and Cedric Gray. You have some all-around linebackers that are top linebackers in this country. You're talking about a team that nearly is allowed to nearly 100 yards, 10 points per game. That's fewer than last year. And then you have a run defense that's only really allowed 50 fewer yards per game. Already, that's better. And then you have 9 interceptions. They force takeaways. They're one of my bright spots for this team. And then we talk about, like I mentioned, Penn State, one of the best defenses in the country. So look for them to go. We talk about the other games throughout college football coming up. You got my boys, Oregon, going up against Washington State. I look for a bounce back game. This is going to be a bounce back game for Oregon. They will, like I've said, they will get another crack at Washington when it comes time. I believe they will be back in the Pac-12 championship. Washington State struggled over the last couple games, so I wouldn't be surprised. Oregon, at home at the Oztoon Stadium in Eugene, Oregon, get the job done. For my fellow alums, Cincinnati Bearcats take on Baylor Bears. It is at Nibbert Stadium, another sellout crowd. Hopefully, Cincinnati can bounce back against another Big 12 opponent. It's just not been the same as the previous years. So hopefully they get a bounce back game and they get their first win in the Big 12. But it could go either way. Baylor has been very decent this season. I wouldn't say it's been an unbelievable season, but they've looked good in some games, but they've also looked terrible in the others. So it's just hit or miss with Baylor. They are 2-4. They are just above us in the conference standings, but we are 0-3. So hopefully let's look to get a win at Nippert and the fans come out and show why it's so hard to play at Nippert. And then the later games, You have Alabama, Tennessee, number 11 versus number 17. That's going to be a great game. Look to see Alabama continue that winning streak. I don't see Tennessee putting up a chance against Bama. That defense is really good. If they're healthy, they're strong. Dallas Turner, Malachi Moore, they will get the job done on that defensive side. Jalen Milroe, what a turnaround he's been since being benched. It looks like that great. He could be maybe that next great Alabama quarterback. He's getting more confident. He's more raw compared to the other quarterbacks that have been there through the Alabama's history. Then you have the likes of Missouri taking on South Carolina later. Number 20, Missouri look to continue that good play this year. They've looked, they've struggled in some games, but they've looked pretty good for the most part. Only one loss coming to LSU, and that was. But they beat Kentucky. They've beaten Vanderbilt. They beat Memphis. They beat Kansas State. So they've looked pretty good. They have a kind of a hard season to round out. They play South Carolina, then they play Georgia in a couple weeks, and then Tennessee, Florida, and then end the season at Arkansas. So they are 6-1. They are still eligible for the SEC championship game, but the road leads through Athens, Georgia. You have to beat the number one team in the country and the number one team in the SEC in Georgia. Later on, you have Tulane versus North Texas. Tulane should win. North Texas shouldn't have a chance. And then you have Iowa playing Minnesota. Iowa's number 24 back in the rankings, but they did just lose their leading receiver in yards and receptions to a torn ACL and Eric Ollie. He got hit against Wisconsin, tore his ACL. Unfortunately, he is not the only Iowa player to lose for the season. They've already been without Luke Lachey, who also went down, and then Cade McNamara, the transfer out of Michigan, also both out for the rest of the season. So that's some huge losses. 2 tight ends and their starting quarterback. But they do get Addison Ortega back from injury. He returned to practice this week, so he should be returning. But losing all the transfer from Michigan who transferred over, both him and Lachey were both entering the season as NFL draft prospects. They were top 10 tight ends going into next year's draft. And then you get the transfer Cade McNamara, who has been looking okay this year. But when you lose your starting quarterback, you lose your starting tight ends, you are going to struggle. They are 6-1. They are 3-1 in the conference. They are looking like they're going to be in the Big Ten championship game. Comes from the west side because all the good teams are in the east. So it looks like they have a straight shot to get there. I don't think Wisconsin with 2 losses will get there, but Iowa has a chance. But with losing those players, they could struggle through the remaining of the season. Later on, you have Texas versus Houston, which should be a dub. I've already talked about North Carolina, Virginia, which I think North Carolina will win that game. And then the later games, I have already touched on Michigan State, the later game, as well as the Duke Florida State game. Like I mentioned, whoever has the ball with the last 2 minutes should or could win the game. So that will be an interesting one. Then you have later on, you have LSU versus Army, which LSU should win that easily. And then a night game at 5 o'clock on the West Coast, but 8 o'clock on the East Coast. USC, Utah, with USC ranked 18th and Utah ranked 14th, both coming off of, let's say, not very impressive wins and losses. You have Utah coming off a 34-14 win against Cal, which, yes, it was a win. It was a big win. Cal's not as good as a team, but they did struggle. They still don't have Cameron Rising, which I don't think they win this game without him because he is a really good quarterback. And then USC is coming off a 20-point loss to Notre Dame, which USC is going to be hungry. Caleb Williams wants to show the doubters that he is trying to win the Heisman for the first time back-to-back since Archie Griffin. No other player has done it since Archie Griffin. But This he doesn't want. Caleb Williams wants to show why this USC is not overrated, why they are the best team in the Pac-12. But it's going to be a struggle for USC because USC, after they play Utah this week, they have to play Cal, then they're out. Then it's Washington, Oregon, UCLA to end their season. That's going to be tough for them. And if I'm a USC fan, after watching them play a good team like Notre Dame, I would be scared. But let's see what Caleb Williams do. He's going to have to show why he was the Heisman and why was the Heisman favorite this season. And then the later games, then the games you have Clemson versus Miami. Miami coming off a big loss to North Carolina. Should expect another loss because Clemson is Clemson. I think Clemson has Miami's number, has had Miami's number for over the last 5 years. So I'm going Clemson. And then the later games, you have UCLA, Stanford. UCLA should win, but you never know. Stanford could come and show. We thought Stanford was going to lose to Colorado, and they come out in the second half and beat Colorado. And then you have Washington, Arizona State. Can Washington, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, but can Washington keep the momentum and not lose to the underdogs of Arizona State? Can Michael Penix show why he's the best quarterback in the country? Can Odunze, McMillan, and Polk show why they're the best receiving corps in the country? Because they're rivaling with Ohio State's receiving corps. So, should be some great games. I'm looking forward to it. Great matchups, great matches everywhere, and that's just not even talking about some of the matchups that aren't ranked. And we have the likes of Wisconsin-Illinois game, the Northwestern-Nebraska, Pitt versus Wake Forest. You have all these good games. Ole Miss-Auburn. I didn't really get to touch on Texas Tech versus BYU, TCU versus Kansas State. There's so many good games out this week. Texas-Houston should be a win for Texas, but Houston, don't sleep on them. They could be something. But yeah, so many good games coming up. And then talk about the AP polls this week. I kind of touched on them last week after the games where I could see them falling, where I could see them. I agree with a lot of the AP polls from last week. Washington deserved to move up 2 spots. Oklahoma and Penn State moved down because they didn't play very good teams, which makes sense. Texas moves back up 1. Oregon moved down 1, which makes sense. I'm okay with Oregon moving down 1 spot because, yes, they did lose, which they shouldn't stay at 8. But they shouldn't move down more than 1 or 2 spots because they played a really good team in Washington. Washington moved up 2 spots. Number 5. The top 4 stayed the exact same. Alabama stayed where they are. North Carolina moved up 2 spots, which they deserve. Oregon State keeps rising. They're moved 3 spots to 12. And then you see a shakeup with USC falling 8 spots and Louisville falling 7 spots, and UCLA falling 7 spots. All lost as last week. USC makes the most sense. I thought they were going to even fall a little bit more just because they got smoked. And like I mentioned, you send 4 or 5 players at Caleb Williams, get in his face. He's going to panic. He's going to try to force something, which we saw throughout the entire game, why he threw 3 picks. First time throwing 3 picks in a game. And he was coming into that game with only throwing 1 interception the entire season. So I do agree with this. As things stand, to be honest, if the season ended now, I would do Georgia 1, Michigan 2, Ohio State 3, and Washington 4. I think Florida State, yes, they have the win against LSU, but I think Washington's win against Oregon is a bigger win, which would put them in the college football playoffs. That's where I'm at right now if the season ended now. But we have to remember that Ohio State plays Michigan, and that will actually, to be honest, Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State are all fighting to get into the Big Ten championship game, and they all have to play each other. So whoever wins the Penn State, Ohio State catapults themselves against the others because they're the only team with a good win as of right now. I think Ohio State might pull it out and beat Penn State. You never know. This Penn State's defense is very good. And Ohio State is banged up with injuries. Like Maya Williams, Travion Henderson, Denzel Burke, Emeka Ubaka, Buka, and Buka, sorry, are all probable for this game coming up against Penn State this weekend. Ryan Day did speak to the media on Tuesday and said he is hopeful that they are hopefully returning, but we'll see. Well, hopefully they can do that, but then you never know. So, that was kind of just my talk about this week's upcoming games. I didn't really. It's going to be a short episode today because we didn't have to preview the last game, didn't have to recap the last games because I did that right after the game. Hopefully, I can keep doing that. Hopefully, you guys enjoy me reacting to the games after they happen, than waiting a couple days. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I'll be back here soon, and keep a lookout for our soccer and more NCAA football and our NFL, and then soon we'll be coming out with our NCAA basketball previews and predictions. So look forward to that. Like us on YouTube, subscribe on Spotify, and then like and subscribe on Twitter /X and Instagram at Net to Net Podcast. Peace. See you guys soon.